My mother's name was Ethel Kahn, Kahn. She came from a place that near Germany. I can't remember the name of it right now. I assume she was born there because evidently her parents had lived there for many, many years.
This was in Russia?
In Lithuania.
Okay.
At least I think it was Lithuania at that particular time because of many changes since then. And my father came from a little place then it was Poland, called, the name escapes me, a little village, Vilna, somewhere near Vilna. He came from very religious stock, as did my mother. And I must assume, from the reconstruction of the whole thing that I have made, that my grandfather, both grandfathers, got together and decided their children would marry. Because my grandfather on my father's side was a very religious man and who wanted a religious girl for his son. My father was the only son. He had 4 sisters. So I think this marriage was arranged. And I have a feeling that my parents never saw each other until the day they were married.
Oh,
whether this is true or not, I don't know. But this is what I feel from the things that have been told to me.
And his name?
His name was Benjamin Grusetz, Grusetz. And I think that this was a prearranged marriage for the convenience of the family, because my mother came from a long line of rabbinical students too. And
so he was a rabbinical student?
Yes, my father was a rabbinical student. My grandfather was a rabbi too. Both grandfathers were. I don't know if my grandfather on my maternal side was a rabbi. I don't think so. But he came from very religious stock. My grandfather on my father's side was a rabbi. So I think that as the custom was in those days, if a marriage took place, and if the girl's family was more or less affluent in some way, affluence, of course, it depends upon what you think affluence should be, the family of the girl would take the groom in, especially if he were a student, and support him and his family, when he has one, as long as he is a student. And then when he receives his own congregation, then he's on his own.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's supposed to be a mitzvah, right?
That's called a kest. My father had kest, which means that his in-laws provided sustenance for him and his family. And they lived with the in-laws.
Right.
So my father had to leave Vilna and go to Lithuania, or wherever that was. And they lived there. My mother, the first child that was born was a girl who died before my oldest brother was born.
I never knew that.
Yeah. My mother had 4 children.
I never knew that.
I didn't know that either until many, many years later. And that's why I was told my brother was so important to my mother, because he was called the dear one, because one had been lost before him.
So he never knew her.
He never knew it either. I think he knows
she
it
died
now.
before he was born.
Before he was born.
Wow.
And then my brother was conceived, and my father, in order to avoid conscription by the people who were in charge there, whether it was Russia or Poland, I don't know, ran away and went to Africa. My brother was born when my father was in Africa.
Where in Africa?
In near Johannesburg.
South Africa.
South Africa. Because my father was part of the English army. He was a wheelwright for the British Army. In fact, he did have a right to travel on any British ship, anywhere in the world that he wanted to go, you know, as a sort of a bonus for the work that he did. He came back to Europe at a time when, I don't know whether he was on leave or whether his time with the British Army was up, I have no idea. But he came back, and then I was conceived. And then my father came to America, leaving my mother and her children home. So I didn't see my father, I didn't know my father until my mother brought me here when I was 9 months old. My brother was almost 2, and I was 9 months old at that time, yeah. And I was told that I refused to go to my father because he was a stranger to me, you know. And my father had sent my mother what we used to call them ship's cart. In other words, it's a ship's card in order to get here, paying passage for my mother. And that was it. 5 years later, my younger brother was born. He was the only one of my father's children for whom my father was present at the birth. So he really didn't know my brother or my older brother or me, but he was here in this country when my younger brother was born. And there's 5 years difference between myself and him. There was.
And that was Davy.
That was my brother Davy.
Right.
My older brother is Matty, you know. And my brother Matty went along to become a physician. And I became a lawyer. And my younger brother was a graduate of Teachers College, Columbia University. The aim of my parents had always been to educate their children so that they wouldn't have to go through some of the things they supposedly would do.
The American dream. The American dream.
The American dream.
So when they came here, where did they settle?
Well, one of my father's sisters, or 2 of my father's sisters, or I should say perhaps 3 of them, had already been here, but they didn't live together. My father's 2 youngest sisters lived together, and when my father came to this country, he lived with them. And then when my mother came here with her 2 children, my father, I suppose, got an apartment for us. He was working for a firm, glaziers. They used to put glass windows in apartment houses. And his name was Blumberg. And I know they had an office somewhere on Willoughby, or they lived on Willoughby Avenue. So my father was self-sufficient, and I suppose that's the reason why he was able to send money to Europe to bring us here.
And you don't know, because I remember you telling me all you knew when you tried to trace your birth records was that the ship was from...
Well, I knew. My family had told me that my mother sailed from Antwerp in Belgium. But when I tried to go to Europe and I had to apply for a passport, I had a lot of difficulty because there was no record of my birth or my brother's birth in Europe. That was one thing. Another thing was that I could not prove entry into this country. For some reason, either the records were lost or whatever it was, I don't know. But the Attorney General covering the Southern District of New York, who was in charge of the case, said that he would contact immigration, which he did. And he came to me. At that particular day, my brother and I were called down to be interviewed by the Attorney General. The Attorney General had said at that time that I was a citizen under my father's papers, as was my brother, but we did not have our own, derivative citizenship papers. And the Attorney General said, I don't know why we give you people so much trouble. You have been educated in this country. And then I said to him, if we weren't citizens of this country, we couldn't practice here. It wasn't permitted at that time. So I said, you see, we had to be citizens, or we would never have been allowed to practice here. He said, I don't know why we give you so much trouble. However, he said, was your mother a citizen? And I said, she became a citizen, but I can't tell you the exact date. It was during the war. And he said, okay, I'll look it up, and he did, and it was verified. And then he said, I'll call immigration, and he did. And he came back and he said, yes, I found a record of a woman coming into this country with 2 children, 1 male, 1 female, and those are you. So I took it at that, and that's why I'm here.
Okay. And what about Chubby?
Well, I had just been admitted. This was in 1930, or thereabouts, very close to that. And Chubby had 1 more year of law school. I met Chubby through his parents in a way. It's very convoluted, but I have to tell you this. My father had a partner. His name was Mr. Tone. His wife, Mrs. Tone, used to work for my father-in-law, for Morris Herman. Morris Herman had lost all his possessions and all his ownings during the depression that we had. See, I was married in September of 30. And during that time, after the fall, in 1929, the market, when the market dropped out and everything went to hell, he lost everything that he ever owned. So he had to make a living. He borrowed money from a son-in-law and went into the hotel business up in Peekskill, New York.
Mm-hmm. What was the business he had before that?
He was a builder. He built several buildings, and he owned a lot of those buildings that he had built. Because in those years, it was very easy to get a mortgage, and it was very easy to dabble in the stock market because all you needed was 10% margin, and you could do anything you pleased. And that was one of the reasons for the downfall. So we opened a hotel in Peekskill. He needed a bookkeeper. I had just graduated. I had just been admitted, and Mrs. Tone, my father's partner's wife, who had worked for my father-in-law, came to me and said, "Why don't you take the job?" She said, "You're not doing anything. You were just admitted. Take the job for the summer." I did, and that's where I met Chubby. That's how I met Chubby. And that was in June, and in August we knew we were going to be together, and in September we were secretly married. And I didn't have a religious ceremony until 1931, June of 1931. So I had been married practically a year before I had my religious ceremony.
And wasn't he living in your house with your parents?
Yes. When I knew that we would eventually marry, I came home from Peekskill for a weekend, the weekend before Labor Day. And I took my father for a walk. And I told my father about Chubby. And I told him we wanted to be married, and that he had another year of law school, and that we had no place to live, and that his parents were living up in Peekskill. And my father said, we had a big house. Why are you worried about where to live? We have a big house. Telling me that it would be okay if we got married and lived there, which we did. I also have to preface this by saying that since Mrs. Tone was my father's partner's wife, she and my mother were more or less friendly, and she told my mother all about the Hermans because she worked for them for many years. And were not very pleasant. You know, my mother-in-law, you had to understand my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law was a grand lady. She was Hungarian by birth, evidently from a more or less affluent family.
What was her name?
Her name was Mary. Mary.
And what was her last name?
It was Herman.
No, her
before
name.
Grossman.
Mm-hmm.
It was Grossman. And she was very socially conscious. And in fact, she once told my children that they were never to forget that she was an Edelstein. I have no idea who or what the Edelsteins were, but they must have been something in Hungary. And she carried a lot of weight. She dressed very well. She had beautiful manners, and she always looked down at a lot of people. So although she had a great deal of respect for my parents, knowing the background, and the fact that my parents had educated their children, socially, they were far beneath her. And it was very visible. It was very easily seen. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I was so very naive, I was really very much surprised by the way in which these people lived. It was so different from my own background. I came from a real peasant background. They did not. And so it was very different. They had to show respect because the side of my family were an educated family, whereas their side may or may not have been, I don't know. But there was the respect which was due us. My mother-in-law did not want her son to marry me because she knew that my father's financial position was not good enough, and she felt that he could do nothing for her son. But we married anyway. My in-laws never knew that Chubby and I were secretly married. Mm-hmm. They never knew that.
So they didn't know about the marriage.
They did not know that. They knew that he lived in my house, with my parents, but they did not know that we were married. Mm-hmm. Nobody in that family knew that we were married until I told them after my in-laws had died.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So, where does the name Herman come from?
My father-in-law's name was Herman.
No, but where was he from?
Oh, he was from Galicia in Austria. Mm-hmm. That's all I know about him. Yeah. Because his family was an unknown quantity to the Hermans. So I know nothing about the Hermans, period. Yeah. You know, that part of the family, not at all. I never met anybody in my father-in-law's family. Mm. What else would you like to know?
What about Chubby? Chubby had sisters, right?
Yes. My mother-in-law told me that she had originally given birth to 6 children, 3 of which died, and she had 3 left. Chubby was 3 died. Yes, Chubby was the only son. He had 2 older sisters. One was 10 years older than him, the other was 5 years older than him. He also had a brother who had lived to the age of 22, who had died 2 years before I came into the family. Mm-hmm. He was supposedly a very brilliant individual. His name was Herbert. And that's why when my son Herbert was born, my mother-in-law asked if she could name him for the son she had lost, and I agreed. So my son Herbert is named for an uncle whom we never knew.
And how did the first Herbert die?
He had a very difficult heart condition, which wasn't known about until he was probably 19 or 20 years old. And he could not be saved. He died as a result of that. Mm. However, later on, Chubby told me that this brother, of course, who was the apple of their parents' eyes, that Chubby never could match his brother in any way. And of course, Chubby was crazy about him too, because he was supposedly very brilliant, very, very smart. But Chubby told me that this brother had been married. He had secretly married somebody, and that there was a child somewhere floating around.
Male or female?
What is it?
Male or female?
I don't know. The family disowned the girl.
Do you know her name?
No. They never saw the child. They never saw the girl. I did not know that she existed until Chubby told me about her.
How did Chubby get his nickname?
What is it? How did he get his name? Well, when he was very young, he was very fat. And he told me that he wasn't fat, he was very skinny when he was very young. And they fattened him up. He was so skinny that he could walk behind the radiator. That's how skinny he was supposed to be. And then, of course, he got very fat, and that was a nickname. Chubby was a nickname.
And why? And the kids called him Chubby also.
Yes, because he didn't want to be called Daddy. He never called his mother Mom. He always called his mother Mary. And he liked it. And so he didn't want his children to call him Chubby. We always talked about him as Chubby. Yeah. The children to this day talk about him as Chubby.
Yeah, I've never heard him called anything else.
But never did.
Yeah.
He didn't want to be called that.
And who was he named after?
I don't know.
His given name?
Milton, but I don't know who he was named after. My father, strangely to say, my father was the only one in my family who called him Milton. To everybody else, he was Chubby. And in his family, he was always called Milton.
And what about the other children? The other children in his
family? Well, his sisters, the younger of his two sisters was a school teacher. The older one did not go to college. She was a high school graduate, and she married a man who was a very, very good musician, who was a member of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. He played with Toscanini. He was a very, very fine musician. He, in fact, came from a whole family of musicians. Everyone in his family was a musician. In fact, I met some of them who had been playing all over this country, all classically educated in the classical way. And when I met Sam, that's my brother-in-law, his older sister's husband, he was no longer playing with the orchestra because he was afraid he was getting cancer of the lip. He played the French horn, and he was frightened that he was getting something on his lip, and so he quit. And he and my in-laws opened the hotel in Peekskill. So they worked for my in-laws. And at that time, they had two children, two boys, Ivan and Gerald. So I met them when I went to the hotel to take the job. Mm-hmm. And I and his sister became very good friends.
And which sister was this?
The sister's name was Beck, short for Rebecca.
Right.
You know.
And what was her married name?
Her married name was Feinblum, Sam Feinblum. And my nephews, of course, are Ivan Feinblum and Gerald Feinblum.
Right. And Ivan's kids are Stephen
And Ivan has 3 children.
What is
Stephen,
his sister's name?
Margot, and Karen.
Right.
And what else can I tell you?
What was Chubby's vocation?
Chubby was a lawyer. Chubby had 1 year of law school left when I married him.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he graduated in 32. And in September of 32, my oldest son was born.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to realize that we were married at the beginning of the Depression. The Depression lasted almost 15 years. And there were no jobs available. And so I lived with my parents for all of my married life, because there were no jobs. Of course, there are many ways of looking at it. I was very much in love with him, and he was with me, so naturally I didn't see the faults, or I didn't want to see the faults, or whatever it is. But we are none of us free of faults, you know that. So I know you could say that maybe he didn't try. I don't feel that way. Coming from the family from which he did come, it was very important to maintain a certain level of society, if you wish.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he didn't want to take a job that was below being a lawyer because he was a lawyer. I don't know. But I never saw that. I never cared about that. I didn't like the idea that I was supported by my parents. It was a very difficult thing to live with.
Your parents had their own business, right?
My father was in the butter and egg business at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the Depression, when everybody was having a lot of trouble, he still made a living because butter and eggs was something that was sold, you know. And he supported me in the best possible way that he could, as he supported all his children.
Mm-hmm.
He did, because none of us were working.
Right.
My younger and older brothers were in school at that time. I graduated first because medical school is an 8-year thing.
And Davey, of course,
and
was
my
younger.
brother Davey was the youngest, of course.
Tell us about your schooling.
Pardon me?
Tell us about your schooling, because you were a lawyer too, weren't you?
Yes. When I graduated from high school, I had to decide. My parents insisted that I go to college because my father didn't want me to wither, you know. He wanted me to have a profession so that I'd have something in my life. And the question came up, what could I do? So I went to school. I had to take a year of pre-law school anyway. So I registered. But before I did, I had thought of becoming a teacher. At that time, you didn't have to go 4 years to college. We had a teacher's training schools at that time.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember that this is way back. I graduated in the 20s, and that's a long time ago. And so I was thinking of going into Maxwell Training School. I remember it was a 2-year stint, and you became a teacher. And my father said no. And I said, there may be law. And he said no. And I said, why? And he said, I don't want a nervous wreck on my hands, because teachers at that time were all spinsters. If you married, you could no longer teach.
Really?
Yeah, that was the thing at that time. So he didn't want me to be a teacher and a nurse. He figured it was too demeaning a job, because I would have to do a lot of things that he thought he wanted me to get out of that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because I had done demeaning things to him all of my life. And I had, my father's sister lived in the same building with us. She was a dressmaker. And she had 2 clients. One was a lawyer and one was a doctor. And I would have preferred medicine, but I couldn't see myself going to school for 8 years and my father having to support my brother for 8 years. And the other was a lawyer. She was Anna Moskowitz. who later became the corrections officer of New York City. She was then known as Anna Moskowitz Cross. And I used to sit in my aunt's home while these women were there having dresses made, and listen to her. I was fascinated by her. And then when my father said, "What else would you think of doing?" I said, "Maybe law." And that's how I entered law school. And that's why I became a lawyer, for which I really am not best suited.
Why is it that you never practiced?
Well, I don't like the practice of law. When I graduated, I tried one case, which I incidentally won. But when the case was over, I knew that litigation was not for me. And then I never tried another case. I did try to get into the Corporation Counsel's office because I thought that would be a good field for me, writing briefs and looking up law and doing things of that type, which I felt that I could do easily enough. I didn't like practicing law. I didn't like it at all. But times were so bad then. I joined the Democratic Party thinking that would help me, but it didn't, because no appointments were being made, nothing was being done, nobody was working, everybody was at a standstill. So I just wandered around, that was all. I had a couple of cases, I settled them, I wouldn't go to court, and that was it. And then I got married, when I met Chubby, and I was married, for the first year, Chubby could not, he had one more year of law school. So he practiced under my name, sort of like he was my clerk, you understand? Mm-hmm. And every time an appearance had to be made in court, I had to go, because he couldn't go, he wasn't admitted. And I was pregnant at that time. I remember going to court with my big belly. Two different motions. And I don't know whether I won those motions because I really was good, or whether the judges felt being pregnant I was entitled to. I don't know which way. But anyway, that was it.
And you graduated from NYU law school?
I graduated from NYU. I went to NYU.
What year?
Graduated, I think it was the 30s, or maybe 1929. And that was it. It had to be 29 because I had put in a year's clerkship.
Right.
Describe the times each of your children...
Well, 28 I made graduate. What did you say?
Describe the times that each of your children were born.
Well, we had a family doctor. His name was Dr. Luria. He was one of a family of doctors. His brothers were doctors. I assume his father had been a doctor too. I was very young the first time my mother took me to Dr. Luria because I had what he thought too, was a chronic appendix. And at that time I had just graduated from law school, or thereabouts, I don't remember exactly. And he knew I was a lawyer. And he advised me to become pregnant. I was in my early 20s at the time, and he said that he thought that if my womb was expecting pregnancy and never got it, it would atrophy. And so he thought that I should get married. I said, I can't have a baby, I can't afford it. And he said, why don't you go to Florida? Much cheaper to live in Florida. And I said, no, I can't do that. And then he told me that he had a daughter who was a doctor and who was married to a doctor. And he said, I don't recommend the same profession either for you nor for my daughter. He said, two people who have the same profession can't get along. I said, but your daughter is practicing and I'm not. Mm-hmm. And see, that was the difference. So he recommended the physician who delivered me with her. Mm-hmm. And of course, my husband coming from the background that he came from, I had to have a private room, which my father paid for. My father, when I told my father that the doctor recommended that I become pregnant, my father said, then you become pregnant. That was it. You see.
Just like that.
So I did. I can't really explain the relationship that I had with my father. It was, to me, it was usual, but I suppose to a lot of people it must be unusual. I don't know. I know that when I was about 14 or 15 years old, when my younger brother wanted to do something on a Sunday, he wanted to go to Prospect Park alone, I remember. And my father said, you can't go. And my brother put his thumb on the bell and he said, I won't take it off until you say yes. Of course, the first thing that entered my head was, if I had done that, I would have been punished. Because in his own home, my father was a tyrant. You know, you had to toe the mark. And it made me very angry. And when my father came downstairs, I don't know where I got the courage, but I did confront him. And I told him I thought how wrong he was to allow Davy to go to Prospect Park, because Davy put his thumb on the bell and it made my father laugh. And my father said, okay, go. I said, if I had done it, I said, you know that I would have been punished terribly. I said, and I think you were very unfair. Then my father said the thing that made me and he very good friends for the rest of our lives. He said, you have to remember that Davy is the only child whom I ever saw born. I was in this country when Mama had him. I was not around when you or Maddie were born. He said, so if I'm acting a little differently towards Davy, try to understand it. He didn't say I was wrong. He agreed with me. But he explained why he was acting differently. So he and I became more or less close. And that's why when I knew I was going to marry Chubby and we needed a place to live, I took him for a walk and not my mother. And I told him that. And then he said what he said. My mother, of course, had been filled with a lot of things about Chubby. And she didn't like him because she didn't know him really. And we were secretly married. Chubby moved into the house. My parents didn't know that I was married. He had his bedroom and I had mine. Because by then, my brother, Matty, was interning, so he was rarely home. And we had 4 bedrooms anyway. When I couldn't live the life for very long, and I told Chubby I had to tell somebody because I couldn't stand it. He said, okay. I did not tell my mother. Called it to bed with my father, and I told my father. And of course he said, I knew it. He said, I guessed it. He said, you know, sneaking in and out of bedrooms. He said, I knew what was happening. So I left it for him to tell my mother. I realize now, because I suppose I'm more mature, how badly I treated my mother. And I do have to say, I have guilt feelings about it even today. Because I know that if I had a daughter, and I know how I am with my sons, I think I too would have been very badly hurt. And I'm sure my mother was very badly hurt. But my mother, being a very independent individual, would never make an issue of it. And that was it. So you see, I never told my mother anything. Anything my mother ever knew about me had to come to her from my father, not from me. And that was wrong. That was it.
But you did what you thought you had to do.
Well, I know, but I think the fact that my mother didn't like my husband was a very big factor in my behavior towards her.
What were your kids like when they were growing up?
We had a wonderful family. You have to remember the times were very bad then. My children never had any new clothes. It was all hand-downs. They never complained, never to me. But we had made up our minds, Jelly and I, that the children would have to know the truth. We would not lie to them under any conditions. And we didn't. So they knew what our situation was. I'm sure they weren't the only ones who knew the family conditions because everybody was suffering then. We had a wonderful family life. We were always together. The only means of recreation in those years was there were no radios, no television. So on Sundays, we used to take trips. We used to go to the park, pack a lunch, go to the park, or on holidays we would take the Hudson River Day Line up to Peekskill. And those were the things that we did, and we always had a very good time. And there were times when Chubby would take the children, not me, on either camera days. He loved the camera. That was his hobby. Photography was his hobby. And I think my children and my grandchildren have inherited that. But anyway, he would take them on tours. And I have pictures showing things like that. Chubby's idea of a life, of living, was very different from mine because he was raised in a different way. So he did not know, or I should say he did not know how to manage money in any way. And when he had money, he always bought us things that we didn't need, just to show us that he was thinking of.
What were the kids like when they were growing up?
I don't know whether I was blinded to it, but I never saw much discussion or disorder amongst them. To me, they always seemed to get along very well.
Describe them individually.
Well, Herbert, you see, my three children are three different personalities. Each one is totally different from the other. Herbert was the one. At the beginning, he was a very serious child. He was very precocious. He spoke Herbert. He was at a very early age. He spoke by the time he was a year old, he was speaking sentences.
Wow.
My mother was crazy about him. My mother taught him the Jewish alphabet. By the time he was 2 years old, he could tell you the capital of every state in the Union. My brother Davy was so proud of him, he took him all over and put him through the paces like you do a clown, you know. And he, of course, was the apple of everybody's eye. And then Joby was born. Joby was very bright, but you see, we knew that Herbert, my Herbert, was very much like his Uncle Herbert, whom he was named after, that maybe we kept him a little differently, I don't know. Because I never realized until Joby was a man, that in a way, he was shortchanged. As it happens, Joby is sick now, suffering from, as you know, from that chronic fatigue syndrome. When he began to, of my three children, I think Joby was the one who was the least happy, although he never showed it because he was very outgoing in every way. I never knew, as my children grew up, of any problems that they had, which I wasn't aware of. Joby was the one who was the most social of the three of them. And when Joby began to see girls and have girlfriends and all that sort of thing, I knew every single one of them. He used to bring them all to the house. And my home was always an open home for anybody who came. But it wasn't until Joby was a man, and he was under therapy because he wasn't feeling good, that he told me that in his growing up years, he was the middle child, and he was the same sex as all the other two. He said, you know, you had Herbert, who was your oldest, you had Butchie, who was your youngest, and I was in the middle. I was not the oldest, I was not the youngest. I was just there. And I said to him then, I never realized that hurt you. I never did. But I realize now that it could very well have happened. You know? And of course that makes Joby and I very good friends, which we have always been, and which I hope we will always be. Herbert and I, too, are very good friends, but in a different way. It's altogether different. Herb and Joby are crazy about each other, and the three of them are very good for each other, but each one is very different from the other two. Very different. Butch is my enigma. I don't know Butch today. Butch was a very, very close kid to me, and maybe it was largely due to the fact that his father had died when he was only 12 years old, and he became very close to me as a result of that. And maybe that is one of the things that bothered Joby, although he never said anything. I don't know. Joby and Butch are very close to this day. All three of them are close, but each one has his own different way, you know. They were good children. They were all bright children. I never had any disciplinary problems with any of them. And I always felt that I was part of their lives. And certainly after Chubby died, the three of them became very close to me. And as they were growing up and were learning things, and the whole world was changing as a result of the several revolutions that we had during the time of my life. We had, you know, I lived through First World War, Second World War, the Korean police action, if you will, the Vietnam War, and now this last thing. And there was a social revolution, an industrial revolution. There were so many changes, and everything was changing. And I am grateful that I was able to roll with the punches, you might say. So I learned a lot from my children. Because they were going through it, I was still living in the past. I learned a lot from them. I also hope that they learned from me, too.
How did Chubby die?
Chubby had a heart attack. He had a heart attack when he was 36 years old. And he was seeing a client at the time in Manhattan. He had an appointment, and he had this heart attack up there with the person that he had the appointment with. And he was near his mother, who lived at that time in Midtown, on 24th Street, East 24th Street and Park Avenue. So he was taken immediately to his mother's house. And then, of course, when I was notified, I called my brother Matty, and my brother Matty got the heart man that he knew from his, from his connections with medicine, who came up to see Chubby, and he took care of Chubby. Chubby was in bed for 6 weeks. He put him on a diet. Chubby was heavy. I told you that. That's why he was chubby. In the 6 weeks that he was in bed, he lost 100 pounds. He was on a very strict diet, And as I say, he was very skinny, of course. He went from 250 to 150, 160 pounds, something like that. And that is the time when my mother-in-law and I became friends. I always went to see his family whenever there was an occasion, because I never wanted it to be, the average thing between in-laws and, daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not that kind of person anyway. So I used to go, whether I liked it. I was scared stiff of my mother-in-law. I was frightened stiff of her, because she was so different from anybody I ever knew, So it was at that time that he was there in a hospital bed, and I could only afford a night. My father was paying for most of the expenses. My father had Ruth, his sister Ruth, who was the richest one of the family. So I used to bring food, because I used to feel my mother-in-law, she was dependent upon her children for sustenance. And my mother-in-law didn't like it, because it showed that she didn't have any money. Because ever since my father-in-law lost all his money and his holdings and everything, she became a poor woman, So just before he came home, when we took him home, my mother-in-law said to me, "If I've ever been short with you, if I've ever said anything to hurt you, if I've ever done anything that you disapprove of, be patient with me. I did what I thought was the best thing to do, And the fact that she was able to talk to me and to apologize for anything that she may have done, you understand, made such a deep impression on me that from that point on, she and I became very good friends. And later on, after Chubby was gone, if she needed anything, she had to go to the doctor. And her daughter Ruth would do anything for her, She would not want anybody to go with her but me. So that's how we were by that time. I had made up my mind that I would never I would never reject the family when Chubby died, because she expected me to. She had said to me shortly after Chubby died that I suppose I'll never see you or the children again. And I said, you will see us. We will. We're not going to leave the family. And we never did. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's one of the reasons why Francis and I are as close to me as they are.
What about the day Chubby died?
Well, that was in 1952. To be exact, he died on March the 10th in 1952. He had been in the hospital for a week. A week before then, he had a very bad cold, and he was home. And that was a time when he said to me, he sort of had a premonition that he was going to die. Because he said to me, I want you to know that if I die, I want you to marry immediately. You have a lot to give to somebody who would be in need of just a person like you. And I got very angry at him, and I said, don't you dare talk to me like that. I said, you'll never rest easy in your grave. That's what I said to him that time. And that night, he got very sick, and I had to call the doctor, and he was taken home to the hospital immediately. He had another heart attack. That was his second heart attack.
How long after the first one was it?
8 years. When he had the first heart attack, and Dr. Gutman, who was doctor who took care of him then, through Maddie, told me when he got home that he could live a normal life because he was only 36 or 35 thereabouts when he had his first heart attack. He said it could be very helpful, but it would depend upon his lifestyle. Mm-hmm. If he continues the way he is now, he's going to be all right. But if he ever gets heavy again and starts eating again and smoking again, he said he's not going to live. I give him 8 years. And it was 8 years. That's exactly what happened. So he'd been in a hospital a week before he died. He had a heart attack. And at that time, he could no longer go to the office, so he practiced from the house. And I took care of the mail, and I took care of everything. And every day I went to the hospital telling him what we received. This particular morning, it was on a Monday, I waited for the mail. I had things to do. I had to, many things that I had to take care of. And I didn't get to the hospital as early as I usually did. And I got a telephone call, and it was he. He said, "Where the hell are you? I've been waiting here for you. Where the hell are you?" And I said, "I'll be right there." When I got there, I found him sitting in a chair. The nurse said to me, "I don't know what to do with him. He doesn't obey orders. He has no right. He had no right to go to the telephone because he didn't have a telephone in his room. I couldn't afford one. So he had gotten out of bed and went to the public telephone in the lobby, in the where the nurses section was, to make a telephone call to me. She said he had no right to do it. She said, I can't get him back into bed." So actually, he lasted 1 week in the hospital. And he had told me, I think a day or two before he died, he said, "How is my Joby?" He said, "If anything happens to me, he is the one who's going to take care of you." I love him very much. And I wish he'd do it. And I said, "I'll tell him." What was I going to say? And that was it. The day of his death, I was in the hospital until 5 or 6 o'clock. My brother Matty was leaving for Florida that night. I remember Matty saying to Dr. Forget his name, Chernoff, whatever, "Do you think I should go? Or maybe I should stay?" And Doctor said to him, "No, you go. There's nothing that you can do to help him here. If he lives through the day, he's going to be all right. We'll try." I didn't know this. See, this came to me later. And he said to me, "You go home and hope for the best." I went home. It was a night that I went into Bertha's house because it's the only place I had to go. Herbert was not in his. It was Herbert and Joby were upstairs and Butch was upstairs. And they're playing mahjong in Bertha's house. And I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden we get a telephone call, and it's the hospital. It called Bertha, because I suppose they called me, and then they told them I was in Bertha. They called Bertha, and they tell me, "You better come over right away." He was already gone. I didn't know it. So Bertha got up from the game, and she said, "Come, I'll take you." So Bertha took me to the hospital. By this time, of course, I knew all the ins and outs of the hospital, so we didn't even go to the desk. I went in the back way and up the back stairs. Bertha with me. And we get to his room, and there's a crack in the door. The door wasn't completely closed, but there was a crack, and I looked through the crack, and it looked to me as if he was sleeping. And I go inside, and the nurse, as soon as she sees me, comes to me, puts her arm around me, and says, "Come, we have to go to the nurse's station. The doctor is waiting for you." And I go, you know. And we get to the nurse's station, and the doctor is there, and there's a nurse standing there with a hypodermic. And he's telling me this, he's talking to me, and she's ready to give me a shot. And I turn around to her and I say, take that damn thing away from me, I don't want it. You know. And then the doctor told me. And I don't think I cried then, I don't think I did anything then. I think I was just shocked. I don't know. I suppose in a way I was expecting it. I don't know, because I knew he was very sick when I left that day. Then the next thing I know, I don't know if you remember Gertie Weber. She was a friend of mine who lived around the corner. Her husband shows up. And then within a half hour, Al is there with another guy, I don't remember who, you know. And they're all there waiting for me. They're all in the nurse's station with the doctor and me. And I don't even know what I'm doing at that time. And they take me home. They don't take me to my own house. They take me to Bertha's house. And Bertha gets on the phone. And she calls, first person she calls is Maddie in Florida. And she tells him, where's my brother Davy? My brother Davy must have been with Rose, I don't know. And she called Maddie. And of course Maddie said, we'll leave immediately, you know, whatever. Maddie came, not Anne, just Maddie came. And she made a couple of telephone calls. She called my in-laws. No, everybody had to be told. Because it was Monday, and we had the funeral was Wednesday. We couldn't wait any longer, you know. So we had a funeral. My brother and my father, who are Cairns, are not allowed to go to the cemetery, were in the funeral home. They were not allowed to view the body. They sat in the back. Ordinarily, they weren't even supposed to be there, but they were there. My mother was home. I had not wanted, they had asked me, do I want the casket open so that I didn't know what the hell I wanted. I think I left it all to Maddie. I don't remember exactly. But we had the funeral. And my mother-in-law was sitting next to me. And the rabbi, who happened to have been a friend of ours, and a good friend to Chubby, was saying the eulogy. And as it happened, Chubby died on Purim, which is supposedly the feast of Esther. You know, that's the Purim thing, you know. And he used that text for this particular eulogy because I happened to be Esther, and Chubby's Hebrew name was Mordecai, which is the person that Esther loved in the Bible, you know. So he used that. I'm not aware of anything, but I'm aware of my mother-in-law sitting next to me, and I remember, I don't know what the rabbi was saying, but I remember she was muttering under her breath, "Oh, I know, mothers don't count." So evidently he must have been talking about the members of the family, and he didn't mention her. But I heard her say that. I was wondering to myself, why is she saying that? No. And that was that. I know that Butch held on to me very fast. And Ivan Feinblum's first wife, Shirley, she was on the other side of me. And we go to the cemetery, and the rabbi calls for my 3 sons to, I don't know what it is you have to do, whatever it was, I don't know. But he called for the 3 of them to come up. And they did, and Shirley's holding on to me. And that was it. got home, and then I cried. And I remember we sat Shiva. I was at home. Viper took me for a walk when Shiva was over, because I had a lot of people come, because Chubby was well known. We were more or less well known. I lived in the area for so long. And then I decide I have to go to the hospital. I had a prolapse. And I talked it over with Maddie, and I said, what do you think? Should I have the surgery before I start looking for a job? Because if an emergency happened, because the doctor had said, the gynecologist who examined me said, have it done as quickly as you can. It's no rush. It's not an emergency, but you never can tell when it could turn into an emergency. So I said to Maddie, what do you think? Don't you think that it would be better if I took care of it now before I looked for a job? He said yes. So we made arrangements, and I went to the hospital to have the prolapse. My room tied up. And while I was there, Dr. Maddie and Dr. whatever his name was, chief of gynecology there, decided that after he had started the operation, that I better have a partial hysterectomy because I had polyps of one thing or another. So I had a partial hysterectomy, and I didn't even know it, But later on, Maddie told me. I was in the hospital for about 2.5 weeks, and I came home, and within a day, I got 2 letters from the federal government, which told me, one for Chubby and one for me, that we had both passed an exam that we had taken 2 or 3 years before, a federal exam, on a dare. We took it on a dare because we were away for the summer in somebody's basement up in the country, and the lady who we were with said, I want to take the exam, but you come and take it with me. I said, I haven't taken an exam in so many years. She said, what difference does it make? Take it. Chubby said, you know what? I'll take it with you. So we took the exam. This particular day, I come home from the hospital, maybe a day or 2 before. There are these 2 letters asking Chubby and asking me to come to an interview, at a particular place. Because we had disregarded that whatever I did, I had to do, I did. And I went down for the interview. And I remember when I walked into this place, very big office, and desks all over, and all I could see was a sea of heads, and it scared the hell out of me, But I had the interview with the supervisor in his private office, and I was hired. I was told I had to start July 1. This was early June or late May, I don't remember exactly, because I got home from the hospital at the end of May, and I took the job. And that's when Herbert joined the Air Force. He did not want to go back to school. He did not want to do many things. Also have to tell you that when Chubby died, I don't know, a night or 2 later, oh God, Herbert came to me. I was sitting in the kitchen, and he said to me, Ma, it was a terrible thing that happened, no doubt about it, and we all feel very bad about it. But Ma, let's be grateful that we had him for as long as we did. He said, not many families have had the family relationship that we have enjoyed. He said, so let's be grateful that we at least had that. Right? A few days later, I heard him walking up and down the house, middle of the night, and I got up and I said to him, you couldn't sleep either. He said, no, I couldn't, but I made up my mind. Nothing in this whole wide world is ever going to hurt me so much again. Joey was 15 years old at that time. He hung around me. He was with me always, you know. When he went out at night, he always told me where he was going and what time he'll be home. And if he was late, he used to call me, you know. I could not complain. My kids were hovering over me. They were taking such care of me. Herbert joined the Air Force because he said he could not go back to school no matter what. He was going to Brooklyn College at the time. And then there was just Joe and Butchie home. Butchie clung to me because he had nobody else to cling to. He and Joey got very close at that time, too. And as I say, I never worried about my children because I always knew where they were. And there was a closeness that grew from the loss that we suffered. And as I say, Butchie was 12 years old, and then he went into puberty, and then so forth. And I grew with him, you know, and with everybody else. And that's the kind of relationship we had. And hopefully, part of it will always remain with us. I don't know. I know that with Herbert and Joey, they're there, but they're not always there with Butch.
So then Joe went to work right away, didn't he?
Joe worked all his life. Joe and Herbert took jobs. Herbert was a delivery boy for a fruit and vegetable store, you know. And he saved his money because I wouldn't take his money. That's when Chubby was alive then. And he saved up $300, I remember, and he bought himself a camera because he wanted that so very badly. And Chubby said, "That's your money, you do with it whatever you like." So he bought himself a camera. And then Joey began to work shortly after Chubby died. Joey never cared what kind of work he did. He worked in the gutter. You know, he was a construction worker. He worked with guys in the construction team. He did anything that he could to make some money to bring home. Joey did. And then when I got a job, it was different. But up until that time, which fortunately didn't last very long, fortunately, because I got a job shortly afterwards. But I never had to worry about these children. I never had to worry. Because I always knew they never gave me a problem. What can I say? It's the only way I can put it.
When did you sell the house?
I sold the house in the 60s. At that time, Butch and Herbert had moved out. You know, they went for themselves, which I couldn't stand in their way. I'm sure if I had said, "I don't think you should leave me alone," they would have stayed. But I wouldn't do that, because I've never been that way, and I wouldn't be that way now. So they moved out, and I figured, what the hell do I need a big house for? And there was another reason, too. When my father died, I converted the house into a two-family. It was a one-family. I converted it into a two. I'm wrong. My father converted it into a two-family house after Chubby died. Before Chubby died. And Chubby and my family lived upstairs. We had 2 bedrooms. It was 4 rooms. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs. We turned it into an apartment. So the front room was the living room, and then we had a bedroom, and then we had the kitchen in the back. We had 2 bedrooms inside.
Did you grow up in that house?
I grew up in that house, yeah. Well, didn't grow up in that house, really. My father bought the house in 1927 or 8, something like that. I think I had 28 or 29. I had already graduated from law school. My father bought that house. So I was living upstairs, and my parents were living downstairs. And I wasn't paying rent because I couldn't afford to. What was the question? I don't remember.
The question was when you sold the house.
Oh, so when the boys moved out, I had a tenant up there. Very nice tenant. We became very good friends. In fact, I used to see them after they moved out. And then when they moved out, the tenant moved out, I re-rented it to another family where you met that little kid who had the full pants all the time. What was his name?
Mark.
Mark, yeah. So his mother lived there with her 3 children. His mother was a widow. Her husband had been killed. He was in the construction line. And he was killed on the job. Something fell on him and killed him. And she was not a poor woman because she had a lawsuit and the children had money and she had money. She was given money, the children were given money. And she tried very hard to, she knew I was a widow too, So she used to try, she asked me would I go with her to partners, with parents without partners and dances, and I said no. So she asked me several times if I would babysit. And I said, well, I'm downstairs. If anything's wrong, they can always call me. But kids were very bad. Until finally I had to tell her, look, if it's an emergency, I'm here. But don't expect me to be a babysitter, because I won't, And then then the kids moved out. Then I decided, well, I'm going to sell the house. That was a good way of my getting her out. So I told her I was selling the house and that I had to have the apartment. So that's when we sold the house. I had a little difficulty because a lot of people came to see it, and I finally sold it to it was an interracial couple. He was Chinese and she was white. They had 2 children. And I had fixed up the basement. The basement was a livable basement, So they bought the house, and the basement was used for their 2 girls, and they used the upstairs, and they rented out the top, because I sold it as a 2-family house, you see. So that's when I sold that house, and I looked for an apartment. I found an apartment on Rogers Avenue. You remember that apartment. And that was the selling of the house. And then I went to, I took a cruise with Anna Mickelson, and then I went to Europe. That's it. By then, I consider I was working. I wasn't making a hell of a lot of money, but I didn't need a hell of a lot of money. Whatever it was. I had invested Chubby's insurance, which wasn't very much, in the market, and I made money. I remodeled my house when I made money from the market. Whatever I did to 53rd Street was money from the market. And those were very good years in the market. It was the 60s, and the market was going gung-ho.
And when did you retire?
I retired in 1974. I started to work for the department in 54. I worked for them for 20 years. I made my niche in the department.
And what department is this?
Well, I worked for the Department of Social Services. You have to start as a caseworker. After 2 years, you can go to another field in the department if you so wished. So I took the exam. Well, I was riffed from my federal job, the one I had when Chubby died. I told you that I had taken the federal exam. I was there for 2 years, and then I was riffed.
What does that mean?
Rift means, reduction in force. So you see how it works with the department. I don't know whether every department agency runs the same way. I don't know. But you get a budget, and if you don't use up that budget within the year, then the budget is reduced. And if the budget is reduced, you have to let people go because you can't afford it. That's what happened. We couldn't use up all the money. So after 2 years, I was ripped because I was the last one to be hired. I was the first one to go. And I was out of a job I was ripped July 1, I started to work September 1, August. The month of August, the end of July and August were the time I was out of work. And I didn't know just exactly where to go. I also had to go back a little bit. While I was working for the Army, I was so overwhelmed by all the people, and it was such a large agency and so many people working, that I remember I called my brother Matty and I said, I can't stand it. I can't stand it. I've got to get another job, And my brother had wanted me to work for Vim. I don't know if you knew what Vim was. Vim at that time had several stores. They sold sports equipment, appliances, and stuff like that. They were a very well-known firm in those years. And my brother Davy had worked there, and he didn't like it because, it's an attitude, And I said, I don't want to go to Vim unless I have to. If I can't find a job anyplace else, I'll have to go to Vim. But give me a chance to find my own job. So I had called him that day from the Army, and I said, I can't take this. I said, I got to look for another job. He said, you want me to talk to them? I said, no, give me a chance. And then he said very wisely, look, sis, no matter where you're going to work, this is going to happen to you. You've got to adjust to what the circumstances are. He said, give it a chance. I did. And I wound up really, I wasn't sorry after a while. But when I lost the job there, I thought, where would I go? My brother Davy was working for the Department of Welfare then, and a cousin of mine was also working for the Department of Welfare. And I said to my brother Davy, why can't I take a job at the department? And he said, you have to take the job as a caseworker. You can't start any other way. He said, and I don't want you to be a caseworker. You'll see things that you never saw before, and you're not in a position to see any more tragedies. My brother Matty agreed with him, but my cousin Nady said, don't listen to them. Take the job with welfare. You'll have more time for your children, which is true because every school holiday was a holiday, He said, and you won't be tied down to anything outside of the job. He said, you work from 9 to 5, and that's it. Which isn't really exactly true, but whatever. So I didn't listen to Matty, and I didn't listen to Davy, and I went to welfare, and I applied for the job. They took me on as a provisional. The exam was being given the next month. At that time, they gave the exam only once a year. That was in September, and in October, I took the exam, and I passed it. So I became, after 6 months, you become you become a member, in other words, because they take 6 months to do an investigation on you. And if you pass the investigation, you're in. In the meantime, you're there as a provisional. So that's what it was. Like my nephew, Gerald Feinblum, was very upset with me because he said, I said he was just prejudiced. He said, why don't you take a job in private industry? Government work doesn't pay a hell of a lot, which is true. He said, why don't you take a job in private industry? I guarantee you that within a year you'll be running the place. I said, no, you think too much of me. I said, that's one thing. Another thing is, I said, I'll have more time with my children. I said, if I take a job in private industry, and if I have to work late, I have to work late. Because that's it. I take a job, I have to give my all to it. I said, I can't afford that. It's more important for me to spend time with my children. So that's why I took the job over. And I was there for 20 years. And in the 20 years, if I do have to say so, I made quite a good name for myself. I was a caseworker, supposedly for 2 years, but it lasted 6, because they were not making any appointments. And I put in my memo immediately the 2 years were up. And it laid, but for 4 years, they made no appointments. And then when they made the appointments, 4 years later, when I was in caseworker for 6 years, they made a whole raft of appointments. My brother Davy became a consultant at that time when I did. My brother Davy always said, I came in on your coattails.
Looking back, how would you evaluate your life?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that I have to be, that's perhaps my own opinion, I don't know if that's right. I lived through a period of history that changed the whole world. So I think that if I were to examine my life as a life, not as anything special, but as a person's life, I would have to say that I've lived the full gamut of whatever had to be in a person's life. I've been down in the cellar. I've been way up in the heights. Not financially, never financially, but emotionally, every other way. I've lived a full life. I've experienced a great many things that a lot of people never get to. Not their fault. And maybe it's just my misfortune that I did. I don't know. But that's it. I can't say that I lived what is called or what is known as an exemplary life. I don't know that, but I've lived a full life. That's all I can say.
How would you hope to be remembered?
I would hope to be remembered as a human being. One who's been through it all and is conscious of many things and be a human being. And I hope that for my children as well. It would be very nice to be monetarily rewarded. Of course it would be. It would be very nice. But I have to say that it's not the most important thing in anyone's life. That's my own opinion. What can I say? And I have to say that insofar as my children, my family is concerned, if you look at it from a point of success, my children were unsuccessful. Because none of them have reached a point where the money was the important thing in their lives. Yes, everybody wants to be comfortable, and that's what it is. But being a human being, I think I've done a damn good job. I would like, the only thing that I want for my children, which I think I have tried to instill in them, whether I have or not remains to be seen, is that they be human beings and treat everybody alike. That's all I can say. What they will learn is up to them. I hope I have given them something to go on. Do you know what I mean? But the learning has to be done by them.